This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the De Facto Leaders Podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 210 of the De Facto Leaders Podcast on the B Podcast Network. In the previous episode, I shared some frequently asked questions relating to goals and talked about the difference between task-based goals versus strategy-based goals. So I wanted to elaborate on that Q&A session in this episode because I get so many questions about how to write goals, both for language and executive functioning. So I have quite a few resources on goals that are publicly available on my blog relating to language, but I wanted to add some that address executive functioning. So what I'm going to do today is share the content that is taken from several places. Originally, this was taken from a post that goes along with one of my trainings in the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers put programming in place that supports students' executive functioning. So to learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership, you can actually go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. But what I'm sharing with you today is actually taken directly from the program, and I've actually shared some of this information publicly in a blog post that I can link to in the show notes that also gives you a taste of what I do cover in the program. So I get a lot of questions about goals. As I said, both for language and executive functioning. People often ask me about writing the goals, doing the evaluation, and the data collection. And really being able to define those behaviors is the first thing that you need to do in order to be able to do all of those things. What I tend to do is I like to think about the framework for intervention before I start addressing things like goals and evaluations, partially because many of the clinicians that come through my programs already have some skills when it comes to evaluations that maybe they want to bolster them, but they know how to do an evaluation. Many times they're already treating clients or students, so I don't necessarily have to start at the beginning. So what I like to do is back up and focus on the framework and the skills that we're addressing and give clinicians some tools that they can use to design interventions. And what that does is it helps inform things like data collection, can help you define what you actually want to measure, what is meaningful, and do it in a way that helps you get away from just thinking about test scores, but actually helps you define things that can be observable, but also relevant to students. So what I'm going to do is just go through some of this information that is in the original post. So writing goals for executive functioning can be challenging because it's very difficult to quantify. Additionally, because executive functioning impacts almost every functional skill we engage in, almost every goal on any IEP or therapy plan is technically an executive functioning goal if you think about it. So when we're focusing on other areas like writing, reading, math, language, or other specific skill areas, it's easier to write goals that are focused on tangible, measurable skills. And it's also easier to focus on the end result rather than the process of getting to the end result. So with executive functioning, what we're actually working on is the process of getting to the end result. And the challenge is that when we're talking about executive functioning, we're talking about internal thought processes that are not observable, which is often the emphasis with SMART goals. So that becomes challenging because executive functioning skills happen internally. So we can't necessarily see them happening. We can't necessarily see if someone is engaging in internal self-talk. But what we have to do is infer based on the behaviors that we can observe. So in some of my other courses where I do focus on more what I would describe as more academic language skills or just language skills in general, I often encourage people to focus on what I refer to as observable behaviors, so things you can actually see. And I also recommend that people focus more on the task the student is doing rather than the accommodations or strategies in place needed to allow that student to complete the task. So I still believe that if you're working on specific academic skills, so this could be things like speech, language, fine motor, etc., as well as those other academic skills that might be on an IEP, you should focus on goals that are tangible behaviors and focus on the end result rather than the strategy to get to the end result. So this could be, for example, if you're working on speech, obviously you're focusing on what you can physically observe. If you're focusing on things like reading or spelling, you would be focusing goals on what you can actually observe a student do when they're reading certain words or when they're spelling certain words. And then, of course, with things like math or writing, you would be doing this as well. So if you had a writing goal that was focused on the end result, the goal might be about being able to write a paragraph with certain elements in it. So you should absolutely focus some goals on these tangible, observable behaviors, even if being able to do that behavior needs to also include some internal process. So these things that are observable are what I refer to as task-based goals. So if you're thinking about speech or language, for example, you might want students to say certain sentence types or answer questions about certain sentence types or define and describe words. Again, those are other examples of task-based goals, which, yes, they require some internal thought processes, but the goal itself is about the observable behavior. Now, initially, when I started teaching about this, I really just emphasized SMART goals and really encouraged people to primarily focus on those things you could actually see. And I still think that many of the goals that you're focusing on should be things that are observable because it's very difficult to measure something if you can't observe it. However, I have adjusted the way that I teach goals because if you only focus on things that you can observe and you only focus on the end result, then often you miss key skills that students need in order to be successful in getting to that end result. And what happens in those cases is that the goals are not functional, meaningful, or maybe they're skipping essential parts of the process that the student might need to work on. And this is especially important when we're working on executive functioning. So with executive functioning specifically, my recommendations are a little bit different than some of those other academic skill areas because the process is the goal. In many cases, the process is even more important than the end result, even though ultimately we'd hope that the outcomes would improve over time as strategy use improves. So that's why in this post that I'm referencing, I wanted to share some specific examples of executive functioning goals that relate to all academic areas that I have mentioned. So again, my general recommendation is that we think about those specific academic areas, or we think about those specific areas you're working on, whether it be speech, whether it be fine motor, or whatever your specific discipline is. So you start with those things that are observable, but that you also think about some executive functioning goals that are more process-based. Again, this information is taken directly from a list from the School of Clinical Leadership, which is my program that helps related service providers really collaborate with their teams to put some of this support in place. So obviously, it's really important for us to think about how goals should be written and especially how accommodations can be implemented and which accommodations are appropriate, because that list of accommodations is going to be really important in collaborating with your team because it gives clarification on what you might be training people to do or what you might be suggesting be done when students are outside of direct intervention. So I first wanted to talk about IEP goal format. Now, I'm not a huge fan of goal banks, partially because many people use them as a crutch. There are certainly some goal banks that are useful, so we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I prefer frameworks rather than goal banks because I think understanding the syntax of the goal is really what helps you to problem solve and write good goals. Because when you're too reliant on goal banks, sometimes the goals end up being kind of contrived, or if there's not a goal in the goal bank that is appropriate for what you're working on and you don't have a good strategy, you might not be able to come up with something on your own as effectively. So I'll share some example goals. Some of these goals will seem more like specific academic tasks, but I've included them here because it's often hard to separate executive functioning from other tasks. Also, these are common goals that may be needed if a child is struggling with executive functioning. So obviously, what I'm going to share today is not an exhaustive list, but rather a jumping off point. And I'm going to share a lot of information. So definitely check the show notes for the link to the blog post where you can see all of this information in written format. So when you listen to the following goals, you'll notice that I focus on the key behavior in the goal or the key observable behavior. This is because I've often seen goals that are so wordy and confusing that it's hard to tell what the goal actually is. So you want to use this syntactic structure that I'm going to outline for you when writing goals to help keep goals complete but concise. So really focusing on those essential elements that absolutely have to be there and get clear on what could be there if it's relevant. So the syntactic structure could be the basic structure that I usually go with is student will X with Y. So student will insert goal behavior with insert level of accuracy. Now, another option that you could do is given insert relevant cue or strategy, student will insert goal behavior with insert level of accuracy. I know that that's probably difficult to listen to. So again, definitely check out the blog post that's linked in this podcast episode because you'll be able to see this in written form. So the first part of the goal where I said, given the cue or the strategy, is optional and should only be used if it's necessary to clarify what the student needs. So what I mean by that is that many people will write the cue or strategy that the student needs into the goal. And while this is sometimes appropriate, I've seen people get carried away with this. And what happens is that they end up trying to write all the different cues or strategies that a student might need. And they put so much in the goal that it's very difficult to actually find the observable behavior that you want the student to do. And it gets wordy, or maybe some of the cues or strategies that they're given are vague and not really adding to the goal. And again, it's just making it more complicated than it needs to be. I'm not saying that you should never put the cue or strategy or prompt required or level of support into the goal, but you just want to make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons. In many cases, it's sufficient to focus on what the student is doing rather than focus on the support needed to get the student to do the skill. So it doesn't mean that you're not going to give the support. It's just that it does not necessarily need to be in the language of the goal. So there are, of course, many instances when it is necessary to reference the supports in the goal. For example, saying something like, given access to visual supports. But I recommend that you reflect on whether it's adding to the goal versus making it wordy or vague, or if it would be appropriate to reference those supports in other places, such as an accommodation on the IEP to be used more globally rather than within the specific goal itself. Like I said, there are many times that it is appropriate to add this into the goal, but you just want to ask yourself, is it appropriate to put? Does it make sense for it to be in reference to this specific goal that I'm working on? Or does it make sense for this accommodation or support to be applied to the student's plan more globally? Now, if there's something that is a support that is specific to that particular goal, then maybe it does make sense. But in therapy, of course, you're going to be giving access to all of those supports. In many cases, Maybe where you want to start with the student is that you want them to do the behavior with some support, and the goal is that you're going to fade it out. Again, it might be appropriate to put it in there in that context, but we just want to see, are we trying to put a goal in place and then fading support? Is that the goal? Or do we want to make the behavior or the task progressively harder and increase that way instead of focusing more on fading the support? Again, in practice, you're doing a mix of all of these things, but when we're thinking about goals, you want to think about what is the easiest and most relevant way to measure these things. So I'm going to give a couple examples of goals that you might write using the goal format that I just mentioned. Again, it's given, insert cue, student will, insert behavior with insert level of accuracy. Or if you don't think it's relevant to mention the cue or strategy, you can simply do student will X with Y. So a couple examples, you might say something like, given access to visual supports, student will initiate the step of proofreading work on 3 out of 4 opportunities. Another example could be, given access to a graphic organizer, student will complete a paragraph with a topic sentence, conclusion, and 3 supporting details on 2 out of 3 attempts. So you noticed in those examples, I used attempts rather than accuracy. When I am writing goals for something that has a lot of steps or that might require a rubric and takes a long time to do the whole task, then I tend to err more towards opportunities and attempts rather than doing a level of accuracy, because it's very difficult to measure level of accuracy if you've got a process that has different steps in it. It makes more sense to determine if the student is actually able to complete the whole process and give them enough time to complete the process, especially if the attempt is going to take longer. If you're working on something like articulation where you can get a lot of repetitions in during a therapy session, maybe you can get 50 repetitions in, then it might make sense to do accuracy. But if you have something that's a longer process, it might make sense to do trials. I tend to err more towards trials in many cases because a lot of the skills that I would work on with language and executive functioning are a little bit longer, and it just makes it easier and more accurate to track. So again, going back to those examples that I just gave, given access to visual supports, student will initiate the step of proofreading work on 3 out of 4 opportunities. So in that example goal, we're just focusing on one particular step in the process, and we are saying that we want to allow the student to have access to their visual supports, and that's if you think that's appropriate for the student. And then in the second goal, we have the student focusing more on the entire process. So given access to a graphic organizer, a student will complete a paragraph with a topic sentence, conclusion, and 3 supporting details on 2 out of 3 attempts. So here's another example of how you might write a goal when the strategy is the goal. So you noticed that in those 2 goals that I gave, the access to visual supports was not the goal itself, but it was supporting the student in doing the goal. But what if you want the student to initiate using the strategy? That could be appropriate when you're working on executive functioning, depending on what the student is working on. So maybe you might even write a goal such as student will initiate use of the graphic organizer on 3 out of 4 opportunities, if you really want the student to focus on self-advocacy and independence and their understanding of when they should pull certain tools out. So that could be appropriate as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to list some behaviors that you could insert into that key behavior section of the goal. Again, the reason I use syntactic structure for goals is that if you know that you need the sentence structure of potentially putting the strategy or cue, then having your key behavior, and then having your level of accuracy, those 3 elements, or 2 elements if you don't think you need to put the cue into the goal, can essentially make your goal up. So really, if you focus on what the key behavior is, it's a lot easier to add the other elements of the goal. Really, you can form the other elements, those other components of a goal around your key behavior. So, for example, some goals that might be helpful for executive functioning could be organizing items in a desk, naming steps in a task, or naming and gathering materials needed for a task, identifying and fixing errors in work, initiating editing or proofreading of work, initiating the use of a visual schedule or other accommodation or strategy, organizing or turning things in, completing a graphic organizer, completing the steps to tasks. And this can be, you can be specific to certain academic tasks. This can be functional as well. Retelling events and narratives, things that they've heard or read with accurate recall, which again is also a language goal, but also involves a lot of executive functioning. Answering inferential or problem-solving questions. Again, that also gets into language. Answer questions and state evidence for answers. Using strategies to infer meanings, such as context clues. Writing sentences or essays. And with writing, you can break it down to specific elements. For example, it could be a 5-paragraph essay with one topic sentence, 3 supporting paragraphs, and a conclusion paragraph, or it could be a paragraph with a topic sentence and 3 supporting details. So these are just some examples. So with the writing goals, the level of accuracy could be task completion, or it could be a specific score on a rubric. And again, you can write goals that are for the end goal, which is the essay with all the elements. And then you also may write goals for some of those strategies or processes that get to the end goal. You may even have some goals for asking to use a strategy. So self-advocacy, asking for a specific accommodation, developing a plan for completing work or long-term projects. Now, I know a lot of these things sound very academic, and they definitely are because I'm talking about school teams, but many of these things can actually be quite functional. So, for example, being able to retell past events is something that you're going to need to do in conversation, or anything that's involving multiple steps can certainly be applied to a real life situation. So, these things really get into a lot of the strategic planning elements of executive functioning. Obviously, you can also write goals for things like perspective taking, which is something that I get into in my social language roadmap course, which is actually also part of the School of Clinical Leadership. The list that I'm going through right now is a little bit more focused on the academics and strategic planning. But like I said, anything with strategic planning can be applied to life outside of school as well. But I do also have some additional tools and lists available in the program that do address how we might come up with some behaviors and being able to quantify things relating to social situations. Because anything that is a social skills goal is really an executive functioning goal where you're just using executive functioning skills for specific social situations. So all of those things could be goals. Again, a lot of those things that I mentioned in those goals are actually tied to specific supports. So the goals are really about helping the student put scaffolding in place for themselves as well as complete specific tasks. So with executive functioning, you want to have a mix of both where you're still focused on the end goal. We're not completely throwing out the idea of a SMART goal, but we're also focused on the process to get to the end goal because many times that is the root cause of the issue. So what about accommodations? So in many cases, it might make more sense to focus on putting the support in the accommodations versus the goals. Now, sometimes it might make sense to put it in both places, so that's certainly relevant, but we also want to make sure that we have the correct accommodations in place and that we also have the right plan for utilizing those accommodations. So what I'll do next is share a list of accommodations that could be useful or appropriate for executive functioning, and these also apply to language. Now, I want to emphasize that they could be appropriate because there are many times when putting too many accommodations in place for students can actually impede progress. So when determining if accommodations are appropriate, we want to ask ourselves the following questions. Question number 1, does the student have the skills to effectively utilize this accommodation? This is especially important if the accommodations involve some type of technology. For example, if you allow a student to type instead of physically writing, it could make the student more efficient. However, if the student does not have a solid sense of letter formation, bypassing the process of physically writing could be counterproductive because the student may need to work on writing to develop their orthographic knowledge. Or if a student is allowed to use text-to-speech software but struggles with spelling, it may be difficult for them to edit their work, which could impact their effectiveness with the accommodation. We may either want to focus on building spelling, reading, and writing skills on paper, or at the very least, be strategic about when that accommodation is used throughout the day. And this is something that I discuss in my interview with Tom Pardon, a dyslexia advocate and SLP, where we discuss how to support word decoding at the secondary level. And this is really important because if we put accommodations in place for students and they don't have solid word decoding skills, then many times they are either missing out on opportunities to build those skills or they're not able to effectively utilize those technologies and accommodations. Additionally, if we're doing anything that involves a device, we have to consider if the students have the executive functioning skills to utilize that accommodation, or if the device is going to be distracting to them, especially if the device is going to allow them access to the internet. Another question that we want to ask is this accommodation something a student can eventually put in place for themselves in adult life? Many of the accommodations I've listed below are things that adults could potentially ask for or utilize independently if they learn how to use the tools or strategy effectively. For example, an adult might be able to coordinate sitting in a particular location to be closer to a speaker, or be better able to ask questions and get support, which is really what is happening when we give the accommodation of preferential seating. Additionally, adults can learn to give themselves breaks, use organizing tools or different softwares, all which are things that we also can use as accommodations. So if a tool is something a child could eventually use on their own, and they have the skills to use it, there's a plan in place to teach them the skills to use it, or it enables them to better access the curriculum, then it could be a good option for them. A final question we want to ask is there a way this accommodation could be faded over time? Certain accommodations need to be done for the child, at least at the beginning, meaning the child isn't necessarily using it independently, and somebody needs to actually do something for the child. For example, tests need to be read to the student, or maybe if the student gets breaks, then the adult is the one that's guiding when those breaks are happening. And there are cases when it is appropriate for the adults to really be doing a lot of support and guidance in some of these strategies. So if it's unclear how the accommodation would be eventually transitioned to an adult strategy that the individual could use independently, the team needs to continually revisit the way the accommodation is used. So for younger kids or kids with high support needs, it's often appropriate to put an accommodation in place, even if it's not clear how and if that accommodation could ever be faded. However, part of a least restrictive environment is not just about where a student is, but the amount of support a student is getting. And if a student is over accommodated, then they are technically not in their least restrictive environment. For example, if a student has the accommodation of check for understanding or breaks in pacing, we'd want to continue to revisit the appropriateness of supports, especially if they need a lot of supports or if the adults are really guiding a lot of these interventions rather than the child guiding those accommodations on their own. So with check for understanding, our ability to monitor our own comprehension is actually an executive functioning skill. So we want students to get to the point that they can do that independently, if at all possible, as well as something like giving ourselves breaks. Taking a break is part of our ability to self-regulate. Again, that's another executive functioning skill. So if an adult is always guiding when the break needs to happen, we could be impeding a child's progress because ideally we want them to learn how to regulate and figure out how to guide their own breaks. And obviously, with things like breaks, we'd want to have clear boundaries around how those would work, especially in the school and when we are working through a lot of tasks that might be challenging for students. So these are just some rules and considerations when working with accommodations. Now I'll share a sample list of accommodations. So we might have things like posting schedules and classroom expectations and responsibilities, shortened assignments where we require the student to do enough that they've demonstrated the skill, visual schedules and calendars, the use of an analog clock for planning and pacing, a study hall or accountability check for managing work and materials, breaks and pacing, graphic organizers for writing assignments and note-taking, calculators, speech-to-text software, allow typing instead of writing, text-to-speech software, tests read aloud, allowing extended answers to be verbally dictated, extended time for tests or assignments, separate settings or smaller group for specific classroom tasks like tests, assignments or study guides given in advance, extra sets of books for home, allowing to get to class early, alternative response formats, or timelines and schedules for lengthy assignments. Again, with all of these things, we always want to be asking ourselves the question, how are we going to get the student to the point that they can do this independently, if that is possible for the student? With all of these accommodations, we want to think about how we might be able to fade the prompts or get the student to the point that they might be able to use this accommodation in their adult lives as a strategy and to put their own scaffolding in place. And we also want to think about how realistic it is when it comes to the students' goals for themselves, after they are in school. And we also want to consider how these accommodations would support students in their long-term goals. Always asking ourselves the question of, is this helping or is it impeding progress? Because we want to be very careful that we don't make students prompt dependent. This list of goals and accommodations was taken directly from the School of Clinical Leadership, which is a program for psychologists, social workers, speech pathologists, counselors, occupational therapists, or other service providers who want an evidence-based plan for supporting students socially, emotionally, and academically. Remember, it only takes one team member to take the lead and get the team on track if you have a team that's not working on executive functioning, and that person can be you, even if you are not in an official leadership position like a school administrator. It's possible when you have the right system, and that's what I show you how to do in the School of Clinical Leadership. So to learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. And also, I mentioned a couple resources in this episode. First, again, I mentioned the School of Clinical Leadership. I already mentioned where you can go to learn more about that program. I also mentioned my interview with Tom Pardon, where we discuss word decoding and accommodations for secondary students. And finally, I mentioned a blog post where I have all of this information in written format. So be sure to check the show notes for links to all of those resources. As always, thank you so much for listening. It helps me so much if you leave me a rating and review wherever you listen to your podcasts, and if you tell your friends about De Facto Leaders. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.